Imagine holding a lottery ticket worth hundreds of millions of dollars, only to watch it turn to dust in your very hands. That is exactly what happened to the Portland Trail Blazers. The date was June 28, 2007, a night cemented in official league protocols as the moment a franchise sealed its own tragic fate. The air in the arena was electric, buzzing with rumors and backroom deals. Portland had the #1 overall pick, and the entire sports world was watching. On the table were two distinct paths. One was a skinny kid named Kevin Durant. The other was Greg Oden, a towering giant who, according to official league scouting reports, stood an imposing 213 centimeters tall and weighed a massive 122 kilograms. The decision seemed agonizing, but for the executives in the war room, Greg Oden looked like a sure thing. They saw the next Shaquille O'Neal, a player whose physical dominance could guarantee championships for a decade. Why pass up on a generational big man? In interviews from that night, executives sounded overwhelmingly confident, completely blinded by his collegiate highlights. But behind the flashing cameras and the forced smiles, a storm was already gathering. Reporters noted in their draft day columns that Portland was betting their entire future on a young man whose body was already carrying a terrifying secret. The celebration in the city was deafening, with fans already ordering championship merchandise. Yet the euphoria of drafting the perfect center was destined to be violently short-lived, because the real story did not begin on the draft stage. The countdown to disaster had already started ticking. By September of that exact same year, a heavily redacted medical file would land on the general manager's desk, containing a truth so devastating it would make their blood run completely cold. Long before Greg Oden shook the commissioner's hand, whispers were already echoing through the dark corridors of college basketball. During the 2006 to 2007 university season, he was an absolute force of nature. Opposing teams were terrified. According to the university's official statistical archives, he averaged an astonishing 15.7 points and 9.6 rebounds per game. He was blocking shots into the bleachers and tearing down rims like a grown man playing against small children. But that was precisely the issue that kept certain analysts awake at night. He looked far too much like a grown man. In scouting dossiers circulated at the time, multiple evaluators cautiously noted that the 19-year-old possessed the weathered face and weary demeanor of a 40-year-old veteran who had worked a grueling factory job his entire life. It sounds absurd, but sports radio callers and tabloid columnists actually began peddling a wild conspiracy theory. Was Greg Oden secretly hiding his true age? Reporters dug into his past, trying to uncover if his birth certificate had been altered. The public chatter became so loud that his own family had to address the bizarre rumors in local newspapers. Why was a teenager moving with the heavy, calculated stiffness of a man decades older? It is a question that hung heavy in the air, casting a strange shadow over his phenomenal statistics. While the rumors about a falsified birth certificate were eventually dismissed as pure tabloid fiction, the real problem was much darker and far more medically complex. The true danger was not hiding in a forged registry of his birth. It was buried deep in a forgotten document from a childhood pediatric clinic, a piece of paper detailing an event that absolutely everyone had ignored. Every great athletic collapse starts with a microscopic flaw, and Greg Oden's downfall was baked directly into his bones. Based on leaked medical evaluations obtained by investigative sports journalists, the Portland medical staff eventually discovered a shocking anatomical anomaly. One of his legs was significantly shorter than the other. We are not talking about a barely noticeable millimeter. The official physical examinations recorded a terrifying difference of 8 millimeters. How does a professional basketball franchise invest tens of millions of dollars into a player without realizing his very foundation is crooked? According to extensive interviews given by the player himself years later, the root cause stemmed from a traumatic hip surgery he underwent back in the 6th grade. The procedure saved his mobility as a child, but it completely warped his biomechanics. Every time Greg Oden leapt for a rebound or landed after a monstrous dunk, the uneven distribution of his massive weight sent shockwaves of destructive force directly into his knee joints. It was the equivalent of driving a high-performance sports car with one flat tire at 100 miles per hour. A catastrophic failure was not just possible, it was mathematically guaranteed. Doctors later noted in medical journals that his skeletal structure was essentially grinding itself into dust with every single stride he took on the hardwood. The franchise tried to correct the imbalance with custom orthotic inserts, but placing a small piece of foam under the heel of a giant is like putting a bandage on a sinking ship. This tiny 8mm asymmetry was a ticking time bomb hidden inside his massive frame. And that invisible timer finally reached zero on September 13, 2007, right on a cold operating table. The operation was supposed to be a minor cleanup, or at least that is what the optimistic press releases claimed. But the reality behind closed doors was infinitely more grim. According to the surgical reports filed by team physicians on September 13, 2007, Greg Oden underwent a devastating microfracture surgery on his right knee. This was not a simple scoping procedure. It involved drilling tiny holes into the bone to stimulate cartilage growth, a brutal process that has ended countless athletic careers. How could the #1 overall pick be undergoing such a severe operation before even playing a single professional minute? Sports columnists immediately began demanding answers, pointing out that his rookie contract guaranteed him an astronomical $22 million, as recorded in the official financial ledgers of the league. Did the executives know they were essentially setting tens of millions of dollars on fire? While Kevin Durant was out on the hardwood scoring points and effortlessly securing the Rookie of the Year award, Greg was confined to his living room couch, his leg encased in a heavy cast. He was a multi-millionaire, yet he was completely isolated from the game he loved. In interviews conducted years later, he confessed to the overwhelming darkness that consumed him during those endless months of forced rest. The physical pain was sharp, but the psychological torment was unbearable. He was trapped in a gilded cage, reading newspaper headlines calling him a colossal bust. And as the days blurred into weeks, those closest to him began to notice a troubling shift in his behavior. While Durant was busy collecting accolades, Greg sat silently with his massive paycheck, and it was during this agonizing period of isolation that the first dark signs of his dangerous coping mechanisms began to surface in his empty mansion. To truly grasp the sheer panic that gripped the city, you have to understand the haunted history of the Portland franchise. This was not the first time they had wagered their destiny on a fragile giant and lost everything. According to the historical draft records of the league, back in 1984, the very same organization infamously selected an injury-prone center named Sam Bowie over a young guard named Michael Jordan. We all know how that story ended. Now, 23 years later, the ghost of that catastrophic mistake was terrorizing the front office all over again. Sports documentaries have heavily analyzed this exact parallel, questioning if the franchise was genuinely cursed or just stubbornly arrogant. Why did they ignore the glaring medical red flags to chase the illusion of a dominant big man? The public pressure on the young center was suffocating. By the end of his rookie campaign, the official league statistics showed a chilling reality. He had missed exactly 82 games, an entire season completely wiped out. Every time he stepped out of his house, he faced fans who were silently wondering if he was just another tragic sequel to the Bowie disaster. He was carrying not only his own massive frame, but the crushing weight of a city's historical trauma. In memoirs written by team insiders, it was noted that the locker room atmosphere felt incredibly tense whenever his delayed debut was mentioned. The fans were restless, the media was merciless, and the executives were desperately praying for a miracle to save their jobs. After grueling months of agonizing rehabilitation and endless physical therapy sessions, he was finally cleared to play. The stage was perfectly set for his grand redemption in October 2008, but instead of a triumphant return, that highly anticipated night quickly devolved into a fresh, unprecedented nightmare. The wait was finally over, or so everyone desperately wanted to believe. The arena was packed to the rafters, buzzing with a nervous, electric anticipation. It was a nationally televised showdown against the powerhouse Los Angeles Lakers. According to the official box score from that fateful night, the date was October 28, 2008. This was supposed to be the moment Greg Oden silenced his vicious critics and proved his absolute dominance. But almost immediately, the grand illusion shattered. He looked entirely out of place, lumbering up and down the court with a heartbreaking stiffness. Then, in a horrific twist of fate, he landed awkwardly on his foot. The collective gasp inside the stadium was deafening. He limped off the hardwood, his face twisted in a mixture of physical agony and utter humiliation. In the post-game reports filed by national sports journalists, the brutal reality was laid bare for the whole world to see. His highly anticipated debut lasted a mere 13 minutes, and he failed to score a single point. 13 excruciating minutes and 0 points. Was this the generational talent the franchise had sacrificed its entire future for? Rumors immediately began swirling that the medical staff had rushed him back prematurely just to appease the furious fan base and justify the executives' massive salaries. In front office transcripts leaked years later, you can sense the sheer panic as management scrambled to control the devastating narrative. The press sharpened their knives, preparing to write the final obituary on his brief, tragic career. The label of a monumental bust was being firmly glued to his name. Journalists had their scathing articles ready to publish, but out of nowhere, in February of the following year, something happened on the court that forced every single critic to abruptly drop their pens and stare in absolute disbelief. Just when the vultures were circling, ready to declare him the biggest mistake in professional sports history, Greg Oden suddenly awakened. For a brief, shining moment, the dominant force everyone had promised finally arrived on the hardwood. In the post-game summaries published by major sports networks, reporters noted a drastic transformation in his aggressive play style. Was he finally healthy, or was he simply playing through unimaginable pain to artificially silence his vicious critics? According to the official league box scores, the undeniable proof came on February 12, 2009. On that specific night, he pulled down a monstrous 20 rebounds, completely terrorizing the opposing players in the paint. He looked exactly like the unstoppable giant the executives had mortgaged their entire franchise for. Another highly publicized report from local sports media detailed his dominant performance against Milwaukee, where he effortlessly scored 24 points. He was finally looking like a man among boys, throwing down vicious dunks and blocking shots with a terrifying ferocity. The fans who had previously booed him began to stand and cheer, completely captivated by this sudden explosion of raw talent. In their optimistic columns, journalists enthusiastically asked if the darkest days were finally behind him. The heavy clouds seemed to be lifting, and the front office was practically popping champagne, believing their massive financial investment was finally paying off. But this sudden surge of brilliance was nothing more than a cruel mirage, a fleeting illusion that the basketball gods allowed him to experience before ripping absolutely everything away once again. The executives had barely started exhaling and calculating their future playoff revenues when suddenly an unthinkable tragedy struck on December 5, 2009, a day that literally shattered his entire career into jagged little pieces. It started as just another routine game in a season full of cautious optimism, but it ended as one of the most gruesome moments ever broadcasted on national television. The opponent was Houston, and Greg Oden was aggressively fighting for position under the basket, exactly as he was heavily paid to do. Suddenly, there was a violent collision. He leaped into the air, but the landing was an absolute catastrophe. According to the medical incident reports filed by the official team physicians, the date was officially recorded as December 5, 2009. The entire arena went completely silent as he collapsed to the hardwood, clutching his left leg in absolute agony. The sound of his knee giving way was allegedly so loud that players sitting on the bench physically winced. In the immediate aftermath, reporters covering the game noted that his kneecap had visibly split apart, a horrific injury medically known as a fractured patella. How could a human body built for such immense power simply snap like a dry twig under its own massive weight? Prior to that horrific night, official league statistics confirmed he had played exactly 21 games in the season, showing genuine flashes of elite defensive dominance. But in a single devastating fraction of a second, all of that hard-earned progress was completely erased. The franchise medical staff rushed the court, their faces pale with panic, knowing immediately that the season was entirely over. The television cameras ruthlessly zoomed in on his face, capturing a haunting mixture of physical pain and deep, soul-crushing despair. They carefully loaded his massive frame onto a stretcher, rolling him off the bright lights of the basketball court and into the dark tunnels of the arena. But as the desperate surgeons prepared to piece his shattered left knee back together in the operating room, a much darker, completely invisible tragedy was just beginning to unfold inside the cold walls of his empty, luxurious mansion. The surgical lights eventually turned off. The grueling physical therapy sessions began. But the mind of the fallen giant was already fractured beyond repair. Greg Oden was securely confined to his sprawling estate, a multi-millionaire prisoner trapped inside his own failing body. While his teammates were traveling the country and actively competing for championships, he was left entirely alone with his terrifying thoughts. According to deeply personal confessions the player himself shared in retrospective interviews years later, the year 2010 was a period of overwhelming, suffocating darkness. He openly admitted to hiding inside his house for weeks on end, pulling the heavy curtain shut and completely refusing to answer his phone. In investigative profiles published by major sports magazines, reporters noted that he turned to heavy drinking to violently numb the agonizing pain of his ruined expectations. He was consuming dangerous amounts of alcohol, desperately trying to drown the loud voices of his critics and the crushing guilt of letting an entire city down. Was the franchise entirely unaware of his dangerous downward spiral, or did they simply choose to look the other way as long as he was regularly showing up for his scheduled medical evaluations? Official banking statements and league salary records from that exact period confirmed that he was still receiving millions of dollars in guaranteed compensation, while doing absolutely nothing but sitting in the dark and trying to escape his own reality. He had all the money in the world, yet he was completely bankrupt in spirit, sliding dangerously close to the edge of a total personal collapse. The heavy isolation was consuming him alive, turning the once promising star into a complete ghost haunting his own tragic life. The situation felt utterly hopeless, but in November of 2010, his team doctors unexpectedly called him into the clinic to propose a radical new procedure, an operation that sounded less like a medical cure and more like an absolute professional death sentence. The medical staff of the Portland franchise desperately tried to keep the devastating news contained, but secrets of this magnitude always leaked to the press. According to the official medical press releases distributed to sports journalists at the time, the nightmare officially returned on November 17, 2010. The falling star, Greg Oden, was summoned back to the very same cold operating room, but this time the surgical drills were aimed directly at his left knee. Another grueling microfracture surgery was completely unavoidable. The fans, who had blindly trusted the rehabilitation process for years, finally began to turn their backs on their shattered hero. How could a human body require such aggressive, bone-drilling procedures on both legs before the player even reached the age of 23? In the investigative reports filed by major sports networks, analysts painfully calculated the devastating toll of his endless medical treatments. Over his first few years in the professional league, official calendar timelines confirmed he had missed an astonishing 39 months of active basketball action. That is over 3 entire years completely erased from his prime athletic window. The whispers in the executive suites grew louder and much more cynical. The front office was no longer looking at Greg Oden as a franchise savior. They were viewing him as an absolute medical liability. He was trapped in an agonizing loop of painful physical therapy, heavy painkillers, and crushing public humiliation. The media ruthlessly labeled him as a player made of pure glass. But as his initial rookie contract slowly approached its inevitable expiration date, the executives were suddenly faced with a terrifying financial dilemma. How many more millions of dollars were they genuinely willing to pour into a shattered giant who could not even walk down the street without wincing in absolute pain? Basketball is a beautiful game of passion, but the professional league is a ruthless business built entirely on cold, hard mathematics. And the mathematics surrounding Greg Oden were historically catastrophic. If you dig into the official financial ledgers of the league from that specific era, the numbers paint a truly horrifying picture of corporate panic. His initial rookie contract guaranteed him approximately $22 million, regardless of whether he actually stepped onto the hardwood or spent the entire season lying heavily sedated on a surgical table. Investigative sports accountants began running the terrifying equations, dividing his massive salary by the absolute minimum number of games he actually managed to play. The resulting figure was staggering, proving the franchise was essentially paying a king's ransom for every single minute he spent, limping up and down the court. Yet, paralyzed by the overwhelming fear of losing a generational talent to a rival team, the executives made a deeply controversial gamble. According to the publicly registered contract extensions, the front office desperately extended an $8.9 million qualifying offer in the summer of 2011. Why would an organization throw nearly $9 million at a player whose knees were scientifically proven to be disintegrating? The internal memos leaked years later suggested pure, unadulterated desperation. They were absolutely terrified of the historical curse repeating itself, completely panicked that he might magically heal and win a championship in a different city. So they closed their eyes and authorized the massive payment, blindly hoping for a medical miracle. But that desperate financial gamble backfired spectacularly when, in February of 2012, a devastating piece of paper landed on the general manager's desk, forcing them to make the most brutal business decision in the history of the franchise. The final blow did not happen violently on the brightly lit basketball court in front of thousands of screaming fans. It happened quietly in a sterile doctor's office, far away from the flashing television cameras. The devastating medical scans revealed that the delicate cartilage in his knee had completely failed to regenerate, and a third microfracture surgery was immediately scheduled. This was the absolute breaking point. The franchise could no longer hide behind optimistic press releases or desperate financial gambles. The cold, hard reality had finally arrived for Greg Oden. According to the official transactional protocols registered with the league office, the exact date of his professional dismissal was March 15, 2012. On that fateful afternoon, the Portland executives formally waived their former #1 overall draft pick, unceremoniously kicking him out of the organization to immediately clear precious salary cap space. He was left completely alone, effectively abandoned by the very people who once aggressively hailed him as their ultimate savior. In the official statistical archives of the franchise, his entire legacy with the team was permanently frozen at a heartbreaking 82 games over 5 agonizing years. He had played the exact equivalent of just one single regular season. The sports journalists ruthlessly declared his professional career completely finished. His massive body was severely broken, his public reputation was deeply scarred, and his large bank accounts were the only lingering proof that he had ever been a professional athlete at all. The entire basketball world collectively agreed that the tragic saga of the fragile giant was finally, mercifully over. But against all logical odds, a completely unexpected phone call from a sun-drenched city in Florida would soon drag him back into the unforgiving spotlight, leading him straight toward a shocking scandal that absolutely no one saw coming. For over a year, Greg Oden was effectively a ghost in the rigorous world of professional basketball. His massive frame was resting in absolute silence, completely discarded by the franchise that once promised him the world. But the league is a strange business, often driven by the desperate hope of reclaiming broken talent. Out of nowhere, the defending champions decided to take a bizarre gamble on his shattered knees. According to widespread press publications released at the time, the official date of his unlikely return was August 7, 2013. On that specific summer day, he signed a highly publicized agreement with the Miami Heat. But why would a championship roster, led by the legendary LeBron James, risk disrupting their perfect chemistry for a man who had barely walked without pain for years? The answer lies in the financial details of the agreement. By thoroughly examining the publicly available salary data, experts noted that he signed for a severely reduced veteran minimum salary of roughly $1 million. Just a few years earlier, he was guaranteed tens of millions, but now he was essentially playing for the absolute minimum wage of the league. Was this a genuine opportunity for redemption, or was the Miami front office simply using his massive body as a cheap, disposable shield for their star players? In the breathless reports filed by sports insiders, it was heavily suggested that the organization viewed him strictly as an experimental project. He was finally back under the bright lights of the professional arena, completely surrounded by future Hall of Fame players. The warm Florida sun and the glamorous lifestyle of a winning organization seemed to be slowly breathing life back into his frozen career. However, this beautiful tropical illusion was dangerously fragile. While the fans celebrated his miraculous return to the hardwood, nobody realized that the intense pressure of the spotlight was silently waking up his darkest internal demons, setting the stage for a catastrophic personal collapse that was scheduled to detonate exactly 1 year later in the dead of night. The return of Greg Oden to the active roster was heavily marketed as the ultimate underdog story, a heartwarming tale of a fallen giant finally finding his footing. The Miami Heat organization carefully managed his playing time, strictly treating him like fragile glass. According to the official game logs recorded by the league statisticians, he managed to appear in exactly 23 games throughout that entire regular season. He was no longer the dominant force who once terrorized collegiate opponents. He was a cautious, lumbering presence, desperately trying to survive a few minutes on the court without his joints completely collapsing. But did those 23 brief appearances truly justify the relentless media circus surrounding his comeback? In the daily reports published by beat writers covering the team, journalists cautiously noted that his movements were painfully stiff, a shadow of the explosive athlete he once was. Yet the Miami machinery kept winning, seamlessly carrying him all the way to the grandest stage of them all. The year was 2014, and Greg Oden officially found himself standing on the sidelines of the prestigious championship finals. He was finally tasting the intoxicating atmosphere of the ultimate basketball series, completely surrounded by the roaring crowds and the blinding flashes of the cameras. To the casual observer watching the national broadcasts, it looked like a beautiful Hollywood ending. But look closer at the footage from those intense playoff games. He was mostly glued to the bench, silently watching other men secure his legacy. Was he genuinely a part of the team's success, or was he merely a highly publicized mascot wearing a professional uniform? The season eventually concluded without the ultimate championship ring for Miami, but the most devastating loss of his life was yet to come. The real collapse did not happen under the bright lights of the professional arena. It erupted in the dark, early hours of August 7, 2014, when flashing blue lights suddenly illuminated his driveway. The flashing sirens cut violently through the quiet suburban night, completely shattering the fragile peace of the fallen star. The professional basketball world woke up to headlines that had absolutely nothing to do with damaged cartilage or missed rebounds. Greg Oden was officially in the custody of law enforcement. According to the sworn affidavits and protocols filed by the Indiana State Police, the tragic event occurred on August 7, 2014. Officers were urgently dispatched to his residence following a frantic emergency call regarding a severe domestic disturbance. The details that emerged from the scene were profoundly disturbing, painting a terrifying picture of a man who had completely lost control of his own life. In the official police reports that were immediately obtained by investigative journalists, it was documented that the altercation involved his former girlfriend and resulted in visible injuries. How did the gentle giant, once praised for his quiet demeanor, end up in the center of such a violent and deeply shameful scandal? The legal documents filed by the local prosecutor's office explicitly outlined serious battery charges against him. This was no longer a debate about unfulfilled athletic potential. This was a shocking criminal matter that horrified the public. Was the overwhelming stress of his ruined career finally manifesting in explosive, uncontrollable rage? By analyzing the court materials, it became devastatingly clear that the physical and emotional toll of his continuous failures had pushed him over a very dark edge. He was photographed at the precinct, his face exhausted and utterly defeated. That specific mugshot instantly circulated across every major sports network on the globe. The tragic image served as a brutal confirmation that the massive potential of the #1 overall pick had officially completely evaporated. The legal ramifications were severe, but the professional consequences were absolutely immediate. The heavy doors of every single front office in the league slammed permanently shut, forcing him to seek desperate financial refuge in an entirely different hemisphere. The legal system does not care about your draft position or your shattered athletic potential. When Greg Oden walked into the county courtroom, he was no longer a towering basketball star. He was simply a troubled man facing severe consequences for his dark actions. According to the official court records finalized in the year 2015, he eventually reached a formal plea agreement with the local prosecutors to desperately avoid a lengthy prison sentence. The finalized details of the legal settlement were incredibly harsh, officially stripping away whatever fragile pieces remained of his once pristine public image. The presiding judge handed down a strict sentence, which, according to the public legal filings, included a mandatory 900 days of closely monitored probation and a significant financial fine. Was this legal conclusion truly enough to atone for the violent incident? Or was it simply the justice system showing a quiet leniency to a former wealthy celebrity? Investigative journalists covering the trial noted in their columns that he stood completely silent before the magistrate, a broken giant slowly accepting the heavy weight of his undeniable mistakes. This was the absolute, undeniable rock bottom. He had already lost his athletic career, his massive wealth was rapidly draining through legal fees and medical bills, and now his personal reputation was permanently stained by a formal criminal conviction. He was officially a complete outcast in his own country, deemed entirely untouchable by any professional sports franchise in the domestic league. With his bank account shrinking and his domestic opportunities completely evaporated, he had to make a deeply desperate financial choice. In August of that exact same year, he packed his bags and boarded a long international flight, heading straight toward a distant continent where desperate fallen stars often go to squeeze out the very last drops of their shattered careers. The Chinese Professional Basketball League has long been a lucrative sanctuary for former American stars looking for a massive payday. For Greg Oden, it was not about chasing glory, it was strictly about survival. According to the detailed reports published by prominent international sports insiders, in August of 2015, he signed a highly lucrative agreement with the Jiangsu Dragons. The financial terms were staggering for a man with no functional knees. The leaked contract details revealed a guaranteed salary of approximately $1.2 million for a single season of work. Why would a foreign organization invest over $1 million into a player who could barely survive a light practice without requiring heavy medical intervention? Publicly, the team executives spoke about his incredible veteran presence and championship experience. However, the private reality was much darker. He was essentially a traveling sideshow attraction, forced to push his completely ruined joints to the absolute limit just to satisfy his wealthy international employers. Reporters covering the overseas league noted that he was heavily relying on constant medical injections just to numb the agonizing pain enough to step onto the hardwood. He was literally trading his long-term physical health for a final, desperate paycheck. It was a tragic spectacle of a once great athlete painfully dragging his massive frame up and down the court, entirely fueled by painkillers and sheer financial necessity. But the human body can only endure so much unnatural punishment. Even the slightly slower pace of the foreign league proved to be far too much for his disintegrating cartilage. His desperate international voyage came to a grinding, definitive halt in February of 2016, when he officially took off his professional sneakers for the very last time, leaving behind a legacy measured not in championships, but in unfulfilled promises. The deafening roar of the crowded arenas finally faded into a heavy, permanent silence. Greg Oden was no longer a professional athlete, no longer a multi-million-dollar investment, and no longer a traveling international attraction. He was simply a massive man with ruined knees and a deeply complicated past, desperately searching for a new purpose in life. He made the surprisingly humble decision to return to the very place where his basketball journey first began to look like a beautiful dream. According to the official press releases issued by his former university in the year 2016, he quietly enrolled back into classes to finish his undergraduate degree. But he did not just return as a regular student. He was offered a special position. The university athletic department documents confirmed he was officially hired as a student assistant coach for the collegiate basketball program. Why would a prestigious university bring back a man whose professional career ended in a storm of medical failures and serious legal allegations? Perhaps it was a genuine act of compassion, a chance for the fallen giant to mentor young players and fiercely warn them about the dark side of fame and the incredible fragility of athletic success. Journalists who visited the campus noted that he looked noticeably different, much calmer, and seemingly at peace with his tragic physical limitations. He was slowly replacing the heavy burden of being a generational failure with the quiet dignity of an ordinary life. He traded his luxurious mansions and private jets for crowded lecture halls and quiet library study sessions. However, the deep psychological scars of his past were not entirely healed. While he was actively rebuilding his life away from the blinding national spotlight, he finally sat down with a major sports network to give a deeply emotional, brutally honest interview, uttering a single haunting phrase that would instantly become his permanent historical stigma. It is one thing for the ruthless sports media to label you a monumental failure, but it is an entirely different level of tragedy when you are forced to look into a camera and admit it to the entire world. According to a deeply revealing, highly publicized interview broadcasted by a major national sports network, the exact date of his ultimate public surrender was November of 2016. Sitting completely stripped of his former bravado, Greg Oden looked directly at the interviewer and uttered the exact words that his harshest critics had been screaming for nearly a decade. He explicitly called himself the biggest disappointment in the history of the professional league. But why would a man who had already lost millions of dollars and his physical health intentionally inflict such devastating psychological damage upon his own legacy? Was he simply seeking a twisted form of public absolution, or was the overwhelming guilt of the Portland disaster finally eating him alive? If you examine his official career statistics recorded meticulously in the league archives, the final horrifying tally stands at a mere 105 total games played across his entire professional journey. 105 nights on the hardwood. That is all the franchise got for their historic investment. While Kevin Durant was busy cementing his status as an absolute legend of the sport and securing multiple championships, Oden was painfully reflecting on a career that vanished before it even truly began. In that heartbreaking broadcast, reporters noted that his voice completely lacked anger. It was just a hollow, empty resignation. He finally stopped fighting the painful narrative and accepted his tragic fate. But as he walked away from the glaring television lights that day, leaving his brutal confession to echo through the internet, one final heavily debated question remained about his fractured legacy, a question that leads directly to the year 2019 and the ultimate conclusion of his tragic saga. The spectacular collapse of Greg Oden fundamentally altered the entire landscape of professional basketball evaluations. Front offices were so deeply traumatized by the Portland disaster that strict medical protocols were completely rewritten overnight. Teams were no longer willing to blindly gamble millions of dollars on a towering giant if a single microscopic red flag appeared on an X-ray. But what happened to the man who single-handedly caused this massive industry panic? According to the official academic registries of his beloved university, he eventually achieved a different kind of victory in the year 2019. He walked across a stage to receive his college diploma, a quiet personal triumph completely far away from the toxic pressure of the professional sports machinery. How does a former multimillionaire find genuine peace after becoming the ultimate cautionary tale? If you pull the historical records from the league archives and compare his brief career to the massive, historic statistics generated by Kevin Durant over the same timeline, the sheer scale of the missed opportunity is absolutely breathtaking. Yet those who have spoken to Oden in recent years note in their profiles that the heavy bitterness has finally faded. He is no longer the fragile savior of a desperate franchise, nor is he the tragic punchline of a late-night sports debate. He survived the darkest side of sudden wealth, debilitating physical pain, and severe public humiliation to finally reclaim his own identity. The medical anomaly of his unequal legs destroyed his athletic destiny, but it ultimately forced him to build a life beyond the hardwood. The mystery of the fragile giant is finally closed, leaving behind a permanent, haunting reminder that even the most incredible physical talents can be completely shattered by the cruelest twists of biological fate.